Well, hello. I'd like to talk about the heritage of American higher education a bit by showing a mind map of the notes that I made from this week's reading. When you look at the whole thing, it looks a little bit like from the movies somebody who's obsessed with a crime scene with connections made between all these different concepts. But there are a lot of topics in this week's reading that overlap, and I thought this might be a good way to represent some of that. We'll begin with exploring the heritage of higher education. Let's see here. And there were numerous things that I thought were interesting. One is the history of our institutions as becoming or being founded by religious. So institutions that were religious became non-sectarian. And I like the idea of the priesthood of the faculty. I think that that's a concept that is changing, and several of the articles talk about that. But it's certainly an interesting idea that the faculty were a very specialized, and still are, but originally were extremely specialized and self-governing, much like the priesthood, and then that is becoming a little bit more democratized over time. What is education for? I think that's still very much an open question. And we've got that here, that it really is. We don't know necessarily what has worked. And we don't know always exactly why we're here. Many missions that are shown here. We all agree that instruction is a major mission, but so are so many of these others. Thought it was interesting. I never had understood the distinction of the provost, that sometimes when the provost title is used, it indicates an executive VP position. And that was news to me. I thought that was interesting. I also think there's a lot of interesting concepts underneath lay governance. What does that mean for us as an institution? I made a note here. It's almost like civilian oversight of the military, that we expect specialized people in our society to be able to articulate their goals and their knowledge in ways that knowledgeable lay people can understand. And we expect that from our educational institutions just like we do from our military. I thought it was an interesting concept here, the Joint Big Decision Committee that can combine the collegial and hierarchical aspects of our institutions, which really I think has become sort of the foundation of strategic planning. And as long as we can align our actual programs and practices with our strategic plan, then I think that makes a lot of sense. Sometimes I think programs, practices, and strategic plan are all done in isolation, and so maybe that makes less sense, but there's certainly an opportunity there for alignment. A lot of things happening in the 1800s. We have the BS added. We have respect growing for the master's degree, or coming back since it had been disrespected. We have the PhD first being introduced. We have then toward the end of right at 1900 the first associate degree, which I did not know was awarded by the University of Chicago. So very interesting ideas there. We have fields that are ballooning, exploding, going from 36 to 150 fields. So a huge array of degrees being offered and a huge array of fields all of a sudden from the 1800s to 1900. Just tremendous growth there. Must have been a tumultuous and exciting time to be in higher ed. Back to the question here of what in the world we're here for. And you have perhaps a contrast between Dewey, who says, hey, we're really here for practical purposes. We're linking learning with life. We're here to solve problems. We're here to do the essentials. And then you have questions about, okay, pure higher learning, or really the value and content of general education. What are we here to teach? And does it matter if we prepare citizens versus preparing workers? I think that's still a tension between community college, perhaps more so than anyone, and the rest of the academy. What are we here to teach? What are the expectations of our graduates in terms of what they know as citizens versus what they know as workers? So interesting concepts there. Many interesting concepts in the Association of Governing Boards article. which I thought, as I read through this, all of a sudden we have in the defining attainment session lots of discussion about 55%. Assuming that this is where the governor's Drive to 55 comes from, or at least both the Drive to 55 and this article have some similar roots. And very important to note that we can't get to 55% attainment without re-engaging our adult and minority populations. And that really drives a lot of our work. We're all beginning to look at that as institutions. How do we get to 55%? And there really is just no way unless we target and re-engage some populations that we haven't worked with as well in recent years. All of this, of course, connected to the funding formula and unambiguous definitions of metrics. That's really hard work. We've got to stop and ask ourselves what we're going to measure, and are we going to be measured by metrics that matter, and have the arguments and the tough discussions about the measurements at the front end and not on the back end by trying to argue you measured something that didn't matter. We should have had that discussion up front, and I think we've done that largely in Tennessee. Thought this was a pretty interesting and almost funny point. If taxpayers had money, the state would too, so it doesn't make too much sense to define or to shift cost to our students by increasing tuition. Never had heard this before. The best way to make institutions do something is to free them to do it. And that certainly is a concept that is in tension with so much of the other discussion in these and other articles about public accountability. Public accountability and understanding that the institutions work for the state or are here to support the state and not necessarily to drive their own agendas. And I think that's a different concept. I think that's vastly different than the priesthood of the faculty idea that may have driven earlier higher ed. Looking at the decade ahead, public accountability here again, it's really in every one of these articles in some way. The idea that we need to be looking down the recruiting pipeline much further to look at birth rates. This is obvious and also funny. If they weren't born, they're not going to college. Well, of course. And so we need to be looking at that. We need to look at the fact that our incomes are flat while tuition increases. And that goes back to that concept that if our citizens don't have money, our state doesn't. And we have to figure out a sustainable way to fund higher ed. I wonder if there's any controversy here whether success rates are decreased as more students are taught by adjuncts. I think that there are, in other articles, good arguments for the value of adjuncts as they are specialized sometimes. But then looking at what faculty members will look like or how the faculty will operate in the future, this was an interesting idea, using instructional designers to increase technology, to kind of pair the technological innovations with the content expertise that our faculty have. Works very well with the idea of the graying faculty. Makes plenty of sense. 8 eligible boot camps. This is a concept that I want to explore, along with the MOOCs, that students might begin in a MOOC environment, and then we offer credit through prior learning assessment after the fact as they enter the institution. Because I think for many of our students, there's so much preparatory work that they need to do that we need to find a free way or a very inexpensive way to get them onboarded to college in a much more effective way than we are now. And those are some models that might work. We're running out of time here, but the challenges facing higher ed, of course, are numerous. Governance, the fact that students are our clients and we have to adapt to their needs. Our governance is going to require that from us. And that's part also of becoming responsive to society. But again, the mission of the institution is still very much under review and very much open for debate. And when we ask this really larger question of why are we here, we have to understand that that's a question that we're continuing to answer together after all this time. And as part of contributing to that discussion, hopefully all of us in administration, we need to increase our management skill. That's not something that we teach very often. It's not something that we invest in. Management principles generally, of course, as an MBA, I have a bias toward thinking that that's important work. But it is, as part of us declining in our ivory tower mentality and understanding how we fit in the context of the larger state. Thank Thank you very much.